Reading from Deuteronomy chapter 33. This is the blessing that Moses, the man of God, pronounced on the Israelites before his death. He said, "The Lord came from Sinai and dawned over them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came with myriads of holy ones from the south, from his mountain slopes. Surely it is you who love the people. All the holy ones are in your hand. At your feet they will all bow down and receive from you instruction. The law that Moses gave us, the possession of the assembly of Jacob, he was king over Jeshurun when the leaders of the people assembled along with the tribes of Israel. Let Reuben live and not die, nor his men be few." And this he said about Judah. "Hear, O Lord, the cry of Judah. Bring him to his people. With his own hands he defends his cause. O be his help against his foes." About Levi he said, "Your Thummim and Urim belong to the man you favoured. You tested him at Massah. You contended with him at the waters of Meribah. He said of his father and mother, 'I have no regard for them.' He did not recognize his brothers or acknowledge his own children. But he watched over your word and guarded your covenant. He teaches your precepts to Jacob and your law to Israel. He offers incense before you and whole burnt offerings on your altar. Bless all his skills, O Lord, and be pleased with the work of his hand. Smite the loins of those who rise up against him, and strike his foes till they rise no more." About Benjamin he said, "Let the beloved of the Lord rest secure in him, for he shields him all day long, and the one the Lord loves rests between his shoulders." About Joseph he said, "May the Lord bless his land with precious dew from heavens above, and with the deep waters that lie below. With the best the sun brings forth, and the finest the moon can yield. With the choicest gifts of the ancient mountains, and the fruitfulness of the everlasting hills. With the best gifts of the earth and its fullness, and the favour of him who dwelt in the burning bush. Let all these rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. In majesty he is like a firstborn bull. His horns are the horns of a wild ox. With them he will gore the nations, even those at the ends of the earth. Such are the 10,000 of Ephraim, such are the thousands of Manasseh." About Zebulun he said, "Rejoice, Zebulun, in your going out, and you, Issachar, in your tents. They will summon peoples to the mountain, and there offer sacrifices to righteousness. They will feast on the abundance of the seas and the treasures hidden in the sand." About Gad he said, "Blessed is he who enlarges Gad's domain. Gad lives there like a lion, tearing at arm or head. He chose the best land for himself. The leader's portion was kept for him. When the heads of the people assembled, he carried out the Lord's righteous will and his judgments concerning Israel." About Dan he said, "Dan is a lion's cub springing out of Bashan." About Naphtali he said, "Naphtali is abounding with the favour of the Lord and is full of his blessing. He will inherit southward to the lake." About Asher he said, "Most blessed of sons is Asher. Let him be favoured by his brothers, and let him bathe his feet in oil. The bolts of your gates will be iron and bronze, and your strength will equal your days. There is no one like the God of Jeshurun, who rides on the heavens to help you, and on the clouds in his majesty. The eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. He will drive out your enemy before you, saying, 'Destroy him.' So Israel will live in safety alone. Jacob's spring is secure. In a land of grain and new wine, where the heavens drop dew. Blessed are you, O Israel, who is like you, a people saved by the Lord. He is your shield and helper, and your glorious sword. Your enemies will cower before you, and you will trample down their high places. Today's reading is Moses' last speech. He's about to die. He's been a God-centered man, a servant of God, has cared for Israel for 40 years. He's put up with their failures, their moans, even when they turned on him. So, in this chapter, he blesses them and encourages them, turning their thoughts towards the greatness and graciousness of God. And through this speech, that is what his focus is on. The opening section of this chapter, verses 2 to 5, is about overwhelming praise for God. It starts with a reminder of Sinai, using poetic language to describe God as a holy warrior who appears in majestic splendour. Remember Exodus 20, Deuteronomy chapter 5. Verse 5, as a king who is obeyed. Now remember the context of these words. They're facing entry into the promised land. They're going to be faced with warfare. They need an assurance of God's ability to help. And this is what Moses gives them. Just the right message for the right time. He reminds them that God is bigger than any earthly power, who is a refuge for all who trust in him, who works his purposes out in spite of our sin and weakness. What do they have to do? Verse 3. Bow down before God and receive instruction from the law that Moses had mediated. Is that a picture of God we have? A powerful warrior king? Or is our picture of God somewhat smaller? But perhaps it's a picture we need to rediscover as we face the battles and opposition of our time. Then the bulk of the chapter is taken up with Moses blessing the tribes. You'll notice Simeon is missing. That goes back to Genesis chapter 49 verse 7, where God tells them they'll lose their identity for disobedience. But what we can see here are three grounds for the blessings Moses gives. First of all, God's love for his people. Secondly, God's actions in history. Thirdly, the covenant that the people have made with God. If you like, their hope is based on the record of God's faithful, powerful love for his people. And it's centred upon the people keeping the covenant they've made with God. Now that helps give us some criteria for when and how we bless people. Any blessing we give is based on God's love for his people, regardless of what I may feel. It's God's love for his people, and the hope that they will remain faithful to God. That will mean that as we pronounce a blessing, we remember God loves them, sent Jesus to die for them. We'll be thinking of someone's future. We'll be praying that they remain faithful to God. Do you notice it's two-way? On the one hand, we're pronouncing God's love. On the other hand, we're praying that these folk will be faithful to God, and that means obedience. The final section are the final words of Moses before he dies. It's a message of hope. He is confident that God will look after his people. Look how he describes God. Majestic, unique, verse 26. There is none like you, he says, who rides through the heavens to help. Victory belongs to God. Verse 27, he's a refuge. God may be unique. And yes, at times it can seem as if the wicked are in control. But God is a refuge and has everlasting arms. our dwelling place is an everlasting God. Everything around us may be changing, but we live in God and he doesn't change. And the phrase everlasting arms suggests God's eternal care and protection. It resonates, doesn't it, with strength, with power, and will go on forever. The God who has proved himself in history is our refuge, and those arms are underneath us, sustaining us. The strong arms of God will hold us forever. You know, I don't know about you, but sometimes when we run to our refuge, we run there battered and bruised. We maybe even feel we don't have enough strength left to stand. But wow, his arms are underneath us and will support us forever. Isn't that just so good to know in those weak times? To lean back and just rest in his arms. But not only is God majestic, eternal, our helper, refuge, sustainer, but he provides, verse 28, security and prosperity. Because God is with his people, they can be sure of both security and prosperity. Now, I guess an obvious question to ask is, well, do these apply to Christians living in 21st century Britain? Well, the answer's yes and no. We live in different times. But look at the promises of Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you your life as your victor's crown. And how about this one from chapter 12, verse 11? They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. We will receive victory. We will receive the victor's crown, despite how difficult this life may seem. And we know from our Bibles that God will give us exactly what's best for us. And the people's response? Joy. God is standing up for them. Moses points to the great acts of God in recent history. Deliverance from Egypt, provision in the wilderness, upcoming conquest of the promised land. And this gives him joy and confidence in the future. He's urged Israel to remember those pivotal points in their history that filled them with joy. And what a lesson that is for us. How often do you take time to remember those key moments of God coming into your life? Take time to remember the events that led to your coming to salvation. Take time to remember the work of Christ on your behalf. For as we do, surely we will rejoice. Moses offers one final thing for the people. Assurance of God's protection and assistance. He's their shield, warding off the darts of the enemy. Isn't that so good to know? When the world attacks us, as Satan tries to drag us down, God is there warding off those darts. And then there's the sword, destroying obstacles along the path. And again, isn't that just such an assurance for us? We don't know what the future may bring us. What we do know is that God goes before us, armed with a sword, destroying the obstacles. The result? Well, we read, the enemies of the Israelites will cower. And yes, like theirs, ours are powerful and fearsome. How can we be sure of victory? Well, because of the work of Jesus. Listen to this from Romans 8. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Everything we need, just like the Israelites, we will be given. Isn't that a reason for rejoicing? So to return to the beginning, how big is your God? A powerful warrior king, majestic and unique, a refuge with everlasting arms, a shield, a sword. If that's not your God, then may I suggest that you get to know the one true everlasting God.